I want to tell you something about the language the National Weather Service uses, because I think most people do not understand how precise it is and why that precision matters. Every word in an NWS product is chosen from a controlled vocabulary. Tornado warning, flash flood watch, special weather statement, hazardous weather outlook. These are not casual descriptions. They are technical designations with specific meanings that forecasters spend years learning to apply correctly. And the internal discussions that produce them, the forecast discussions that professionals like me read before the public versions go out, are written in a language that is even more specific, the kind of language that says exactly what the atmosphere is doing and why and what it is going to do next, with a precision that the public products deliberately soften for a general audience. I have been reading this language professionally for 15 years. I know what belongs in a special weather statement and what does not. I know what instructions are appropriate for what events and how the language is structured, and what it means when the language does not fit the event it is attached to. What I found in the Fenwick County Archive did not fit. It has not fit for 30 years, and it took me moving to Fenwick to understand why it was there. I spent a decade as a broadcast meteorologist in Nashville, which means I spent a decade standing in front of a green screen telling people whether to bring an umbrella, and I was good at it in the way that people are good at jobs that do not fully use them. The atmospheric science degree I had spent 4 years earning was mostly decorative in that context. Television weather is performance first and meteorology second, and I had done enough performance to understand that it was not what I wanted to spend the rest of my professional life doing. I left broadcast and went remote, working as a weather data analyst for an agricultural consulting firm that served farming clients across the Mid-South. I monitored regional forecasts and issued crop protection advisories and read forecast discussions all day and talked to almost no one. And it was the most professionally satisfied I had been in years. I moved to Fenwick because I could live anywhere, and Fenwick was affordable, and because I had been studying the topography of the region for a client in south-central Kentucky, and I looked at the valley and the 2 ridgelines that flanked it and thought that was a place with interesting weather. I think like that. It is an occupational characteristic. I rented a 2-story house on the east side of town with a back porch facing the eastern ridgeline, which I immediately designated as my primary weather watching station. I set up my personal weather station in the backyard within the first week. I had my professional monitoring software running on my laptop before I had the kitchen fully unpacked. I was, within days of arriving, better equipped to monitor weather in that valley than essentially anyone else living in it. I want to tell you that because I want you to understand what it meant when the warning still almost came too late. My neighbor across the street was a man named Clifford, who was in his late 60s and had lived in Fenwick his entire life, and who brought over food that first weekend the way people in small Kentucky towns still do, which I found both touching and slightly outside my experience of how neighbors behaved. We ended up on my front porch for 2 hours, and he told me about the town, its history and its people, and the particular ways that the valley behaved in different seasons, and it was the best orientation to a new place I have ever received. Before he left, he said something that I filed away without fully hearing. He said that, being a weather person, I would probably notice things about Fenwick weather that other people missed. He said, when I did, his door was open. I thanked him and thought he meant the topographic effects on local forecasting, the way the ridgelines channeled and compressed weather systems moving through the valley, the kind of thing my professional background would let me see that a layperson would not. I thought he was being neighborly and offering to talk about local weather patterns, the way old-timers in specific places like to talk to newcomers about what made their particular piece of the world distinctive. He did not mean that. I understood what he meant 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, when I was monitoring the NWS forecast discussion for the region over my first cup of coffee, and a special weather statement for Fenwick County came through. The meteorological content was standard. A frontal boundary moving through the region, wind and rain and falling temperatures, nothing that rose to the level of unusual. Full frontal passages in south-central Kentucky were routine events, and this one was being handled routinely by the forecast office in Paducah. And then I read this line: residents of the Fenwick Valley floor are advised to remain indoors during the passage of the frontal boundary and for a period of no less than 1 hour following the cessation of precipitation. I read it twice. I read it a third time. I know NWS language. I have read thousands of special weather statements over my career, and I know the difference between the language that belongs in them and the language that does not. The same way a lawyer knows the difference between language that belongs in a contract and language that has wandered in from somewhere else. Remain indoors for 1 hour after precipitation ceases was not language I had ever seen in a special weather statement attached to a routine frontal passage. It was not language that attached to any meteorological event I could identify in any framework I had been trained in. I went into the NWS product archive and searched for the specific phrase. It was there. Going back through the digital record as far as the archive extended, the same line, word for word, in special weather statements for Fenwick County, attached to specific storm types passing through this valley. Not every statement, not every storm, but consistently, over decades, a long clear record of the same instruction appearing in the same product for the same county. Someone at the Paducah office had been putting that line in Fenwick County statements for a very long time. I walked across the street and knocked on Clifford's door. He made coffee, and we sat at his kitchen table, and I showed him the statement on my phone, and he read the line and nodded once, slowly, and asked if I wanted the short version or the full version. I said the full version. He said that certain storms moving through the Fenwick Valley did not come alone. He said it the way he said everything, plainly and without embellishment, the way a man states a fact that the strangeness has long since worn smooth on. He said some storms, not all of them, and not even most of them, but a specific kind with specific characteristics that people in Fenwick had been identifying by feel for longer than anyone could trace the knowledge back, brought something with them through the valley, something that moved with the weather front, the way debris moved with a river current, carried in the storm and present in the valley during it, and for some period after, and then gone when the storm was fully through. I asked what the something was. He said he did not know. He said he had never met anyone in Fenwick who claimed to know with any certainty, and he had grown up here and had known most everyone in town for most of his life. He said what people in Fenwick knew was what it did and what kept you safe from it. He said it moved through the valley with the storm and through streets and yards and around buildings, not inside buildings, outside where the storm was, and for somewhere between 30 minutes and an hour after the rain stopped, before it dispersed or moved on or completed. Whatever it did when it was done, it was still in the valley. You could not tell when it had gone because you could not see it, and it produced no sound, and the only evidence of it that anyone had ever been able to describe clearly was what happened to people who were outside during the period after the rain stopped and before the hour was up. I asked what happened to them. He held his coffee mug in both hands and looked at the table for a moment. He said the people who had been outside during that window came inside different. Not all of them, not dramatically, not in any way a stranger would catch or a doctor could measure. But the people who knew them well noticed a flatness in the eyes, a quality of being slightly less present in their own lives, as though something had been taken from the outermost layer of what made them specifically themselves. He said it faded in most cases, over weeks or months, and people returned to themselves. In a few cases, it did not fade. He said he did not want to talk about the cases where it did not fade. I asked how the NWS statement came to have that line in it. He said there had been a meteorologist at the Paducah office about 30 years ago, a man named Walt Briggs, who grew up in Fenwick. Walt understood what the storms did, and he found a way to put the warning into official language without being able to explain in official terms what the warning was for. He said Walt retired a long time ago, but the forecasters who came after him kept the line in the Fenwick County statements, and the forecasters who came after them kept it, and now it was simply part of the regional product for that county, passed down through the office, the way certain knowledge got passed down in Fenwick itself, without full explanation, but with the understanding that it mattered enough to keep. I sat with my coffee for a long time. Then I said, the National Weather Service has been issuing a warning for something they cannot officially acknowledge for 30 years. Clifford said yes. He said Walt was a practical man who loved this town and who figured out that a line in an official statement was better than nothing. I thought about Walt Briggs for a long time after that conversation. A meteorologist from a small Kentucky town who goes to work for the federal government and spends his career looking for a way to protect the people he grew up with using the only tools his job gives him. Who finds the gap between what he knows and what he can say and fills it as best he can with the language that the system will hold. Who writes a single line into a weather statement and passes it to the next forecaster and trusts that the line will keep being there after he is gone. It had kept being there for 30 years. I asked Clifford how you told which storms to invoke the rule for, because a warning only mattered if you knew when to use it. He said the NWS statement was the answer. Not every storm that came through the valley produced the statement with the line, only the ones that warranted it. The people of Fenwick had learned to watch for the special weather statements specifically, not tornado warnings or flood statements or any other product. And when that statement came through with the 1-hour language, they knew what kind of storm was coming, and they knew the shape of what they needed to do. He said, my professional monitoring setup meant I would see the statement before most people in town, because I was watching the raw feed rather than waiting for it to filter through weather apps and local news. He said having someone in Fenwick who caught the statement early was genuinely useful. I asked how early the statement typically preceded the storm. He said it varied, sometimes 2 or 3 hours, sometimes less. He paused and said the thing everyone in Fenwick had always lived with was the fear that the warning would come too late, that the storm would arrive before the statement, that someone would be outside when the rain stopped without knowing they needed to be inside. He said it had happened. He said those were the cases he did not want to talk about. I went back to my house and pulled up the full historical record of the Fenwick County statements in the archive and mapped them against the historical storm data for the valley. And what I found was a pattern that my training could not fully account for from meteorological principles alone, a specific combination of atmospheric conditions during certain frontal passages that the Paducah office had apparently learned over decades of experience with this valley was the trigger, not wind speed or precipitation intensity or any single variable. A combination that I could identify in retrospect, but that would have been difficult to predict from theory. I also found the 3 events where the storm record showed the frontal passage had occurred before the statement was issued. 3 times in the digital archive where the warning came after the fact, where whatever moved through the Fenwick Valley had already moved through before anyone was officially told to be inside. I sat with those 3 dates for a long time. I did not know what had happened on those specific nights and days. I knew the lead time was negative, and I knew what Clifford had told me about what the window after the rain stopping meant for the people who were outside in it. I went back across the street. Clifford did not want to talk about the specific events. He said this gently and clearly, the decision already made before I asked, but he told me the general shape. He said the times the warning came too late were the times that Fenwick still carried in the specific way the communities carried things they could not fully put into words. Not talked about directly, but present, referenced in the way older residents spoke around the edges of certain years, a careful indirection that told you the thing was there without naming it. He said in each of the events he was aware of, people who were outside during the window came inside, and some were fine and some were not, and the ones who were not fine in the way he had already described. And in most of those cases, they came back to themselves over time. He said the worst event he knew of was not the one with the most people affected. It was one where a single person had been alone outside for the full window, from when the rain stopped until well past the hour, because there was no warning, and they did not know. And when they came inside, the flatness was total, and it did not fade over weeks or months or years. He said they had lived in Fenwick for another 12 years before their family moved them somewhere closer to extended family. And he said the way he had heard it, described by people who knew them, was that nobody was home behind the eyes anymore. Not the partial dimming of the other cases. Just gone. The specific presence of that person. The thing that made them themselves, and nothing there instead. He stopped talking about it there, and I did not push. I drove home in the late afternoon and stood on my back porch looking at the ridgeline against the pale fall sky and thought about Walt Briggs writing a line into a weather statement for a thing he could not name, and about the people in Fenwick who had learned to watch for that line, and about the 3 times the line had arrived too late. I thought about my monitoring setup, the professional software, the raw feed, the custom alert I had not yet built, but was already thinking about building. I went inside and built it that evening. A push notification to my phone on receipt of any incoming NWS product for Fenwick County, day or night, any hour. I tested it and it worked, and I set it and left it running. I did not think of myself as taking on a responsibility. I thought of myself as using the tools I had in the situation I was in, which is what a practical person does. The storm that tested it came in November. The regional forecast had been tracking the system all day as a minor frontal passage, nothing significant, a routine fall event. I had been monitoring it with background attention, the kind of professional awareness that does not rise to the level of active concern. I was on my back porch at 7 in the evening, watching the first rain bands cross the ridgeline, when my phone buzzed. The special weather statement, with the line. I looked at the issuance time. I opened the radar on my professional software and looked at the storm's position and forward speed, and I did the calculation in the automatic way of someone who has done it 10,000 times. The storm would reach the valley floor in less than 20 minutes. The statement had just been issued. I went inside immediately and locked the back door and checked the front door and went through the house, making sure every exterior door was secured. I looked across the street and Clifford's lights were on, and I knew he had a weather radio and would have heard the tone alert when the statement came through. I checked both porches to make sure I had not left anything outside that would give me a reason to go back out. I was inside, and I was going to stay inside. The rain hit hard and fast, the frontal passage arriving the way these specific storms arrived, not more intense than ordinary rain, but different in a way I had started to feel before I could name it, a quality in the air as the storm reached the valley that my body registered as something held and waiting. I stood at the front window and watched the street. 3 houses that had been dark came on, lights in windows, the specific warm yellow of interior lights coming to life. And I thought about the people in those houses and whether they had heard the statement or whether some older instinct had moved them inside without an official reason. A car pulled into the driveway 2 doors down, and the driver got out and ran for the front door without turning the car off. I watched the car idling in the rain for a long time. It was still running when the rain got too heavy to see it clearly. Eventually, the sound of it stopped. I stood at the window and wondered whether the driver had heard the statement or whether they had simply come home late and not understood what they had run inside from. The rain ran for 40 minutes. When it stopped, I moved to the back porch window and looked at the ridgeline and the wet yard in the quiet that followed. The dripping from the eaves and the gutters and the dark trees at the back of the property. The clean smell of a rain-washed night coming through the glass. I did not go outside. I watched the clock on the wall above the kitchen doorway. The kind of watching you do when the specific passage of time is the only thing that matters, when each minute is the thing you are counting, rather than a container for other things. After an hour, I went to the back door and opened it and stood on the threshold, not outside, just at the edge of it, 1 foot in the house. I breathed the after-storm air and looked at the dark yard and the dark ridgeline and the stars beginning to show through the clearing sky. The night was clean and cold and quiet and entirely ordinary in every way I could perceive. I stood in the doorway for a few minutes. Then I went inside and made dinner and did not think too carefully about what had moved through the valley with that front, and whether the 20-minute lead time had been enough, and whether everyone who needed to be inside had been inside when the rain stopped. I thought about the car in the driveway, the driver who had run for the door without turning off the engine. I thought about whether they had known. A week after the November storm, I sent an email to the Paducah NWS office. I identified myself professionally and said I had been living in Fenwick County for 2 months and had a question about the special weather statement language for the area. I asked about the 1-hour indoor advisory, where it came from and what its basis was. 3 days later, I heard back from a senior forecaster named Alan. He wrote in the careful language of someone who had answered a version of this question before, the language of a professional navigating the gap between what he knew and what he could say officially. He said the language had been part of the Fenwick County statement product for as long as the office's institutional memory extended, that it predated the current staff, and that the office understood it to reflect a locally specific atmospheric phenomenon in the valley affecting air quality in the period immediately following certain frontal passages, a phenomenon not fully characterized in the scientific literature, but that the office had chosen to continue flagging, given the consistency of local historical reports. Air quality. That was the category the official record had found for it. Not what it was, not what Walt Briggs had known it was when he wrote the line 30 years ago, but the closest box the system had for something the system could not name, an atmospheric phenomenon affecting air quality. Something in the air after the rain stops that you should not be outside breathing. I wrote back and thanked Alan and did not ask any further questions. I understood now what Walt had done. You find the language the system can hold, and you put the thing inside it, and you pass it to the next person, and you trust that the line will keep being there. Walt could not write in an official NWS product that something came through the Fenwick Valley with certain storms and took something from the people who were outside after the rain stopped. There was no box for that. There was a box for air quality phenomena with localized effects, and Walt had put the warning in that box, and it had kept being there for 30 years, and the people of Fenwick had kept watching for it. I added a secondary alert to my monitoring setup that evening, one that would push the notification to my phone 3 separate times in case the first one was missed. I am not usually a person who builds redundancy into personal notification systems. I built redundancy into this one. I am writing this on a cold February evening on my front porch with a cup of coffee, the ridgeline dark above the town against a sky that is doing nothing tonight, just being a clear winter sky full of stars. No products issued for Fenwick County, no frontal systems in the regional picture for the next 48 hours. I want to say something to anyone who monitors weather professionally or who pays close attention to NWS products for their region. Something specific and useful. If you ever look at a weather product for your county and find language that does not fit the meteorological event it is attached to, instructions that are more cautious than the weather alone would justify. Specific advisories with a quality of precision that suggests they were written for a reason. The product does not state. I want you to take that language seriously. The NWS employs forecasters who grew up in specific places, who know things about those places that the official scientific framework does not have categories for, who sometimes find ways to put into official language the things their communities have always known but cannot say through the channels that official language requires. The line gets passed to the next forecaster. They pass it to the next one. It sits in the product archive for decades, carrying its original meaning forward in the only form the system would accept. Look at the archive for your county. Look for lines that have been in every relevant statement for longer than the current staff can account for. Look for instructions that are specific in a way that goes beyond what the forecast warrants. Find whoever in your town has been there long enough to know why the line is there. There is a reason. There is always a reason. Walt Briggs wrote that line for a reason, and it has been in every applicable Fenwick County statement for 30 years, and twice in the past 4 months, I have been inside with the doors locked because that line came through in time. Once it came through with 20 minutes to spare. I think about that 20 minutes more than I think about most things. I think about the 3 times in the digital archive where the lead time was negative, where the storm arrived before the statement, where the warning was too late, and whatever moved through the Fenwick Valley with those fronts moved through a town where not everyone was inside, because there was no official word that they needed to be. I have my alerts set up. I have redundancy in the alerts. I will see the statement as fast as it is possible to see it with the tools I have, which are better tools than most people in this valley have, which is the only thing I can do with the fact that I happen to be here, and I happen to have them. I am not the warning system. I am a person with good equipment and a professional background and a faster feed than my neighbors, sitting on a porch in a small Kentucky town watching a clear winter sky. Walt Briggs looked out for this town in the only language his job gave him for 30 years. I am going to look out for it in the language mine gives me. The porch is cold, and the coffee is going lukewarm, and the stars over the ridgeline are the particular dense stars of a clear night in the hill country, the kind of stars you forget exist until you live somewhere dark enough to see them. My phone is in my pocket. The alert is on. I will be watching tomorrow.